Okay, welcome everybody. Wanted to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon that's sponsored by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, which is an association that's part of the Universal Peace Federation. And we have a very interesting topic today. We're looking at North Korea's economic dilemma, more of the same or opportunities for change. There's a Chinese saying that every crisis has within it the seeds of opportunity, right? So, if you look at the North Korean economy, people are always looking for signs that might indicate even slight changes of direction from the tight party controls. Is there opening? Are there opportunities for free market activity to come in or trade with China or other countries? But in the recently released report of the Eighth Party Congress, over 40% of it was devoted to the rural sector and looking at the agricultural economy. So is this a positive sign that the party is ready to, look at the economic imbalances in the economy? Or is it really just more of the same? Is there going to be a continued party line approach? So we have some speakers today who are going to delve into these reports and provide us with some information about how we can interpret it and look at some statistics about what's really going on in the economy, and hopefully offer us some insights about ways that we might prepare for an eventual opening of North Korea and the reforms that may go on there as well. So one of the interesting things about our presenters today, they both are living in Israel at the moment. So we want to really thank them for joining us. It's 9 o'clock at night for them, and really appreciate them staying up late to be able to present in this webinar today. So our first speaker for today is Benjamin Katzeff Silberstein, who just recently got his Ph.D. Congratulations, Ben. Round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
So he received his Ph.D. in history last year from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Freiburg Center at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So he's also a non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center and 38 North. He's somebody who is constantly researching and writing about North Korea, and we're really lucky to have him here today. He has a BA in political science from Stockholm University, and he graduated from the Korean language program at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul. So without any further ado, Benjamin, I wanted to turn it over to you and ask you you're going to give us a little presentation on some materials you just wrote recently, and then we'll follow up with some questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I have a few slides I want to share, but I can't help but jump at the question that Roger just raised about, I know that's what we're, it's the sort of broad topic we're talking about, whether or not things are moving in the North Korean economy. I think that the signs, personally, I'm quite pessimistic about the signs from the party Congress. If we look at the rhetoric, much of it over the past couple of years has been about really clamping down on free market actors and strengthening state control over the economy. But I look forward to talking about this with all of you today. So I'm gonna just share my screen and show a very small number of graphs. So when I first started thinking about exactly what to bring up during this talk, it was 2 days before something very important changed in North Korea's economic situation. Some of you might have seen this news already, but a couple of days ago, the first freight train between North Korea and China for in 2 years went across the bridge from Sinŭiju in North Korea to Dandong in China. So this is a very important event. North Korea virtually closed its border with China, which is its only real trading partner at the beginning of COVID to protect against the virus. And this is, as I'm going to be talking about for a few minutes, this has had very, very problematic effects on the economy of the country. But things might be changing now, although it remains to be seen exactly how. So how should we understand the North Korean economy under COVID? And so I'm just going to give a brief snapshot of where I believe things stand based on my research. So just for context, North Korea, China represents 96% of all trade that North Korea has with the outside world. And it's very important to remember, because when we're talking about North Korea's foreign trade, we're really basically only talking about North Korea's trade with China. Now, there's been quite a bit of talk since the border was shut down, and also with the sanctions that were already imposed on North Korea before that, about North Korea's inability to export its most important export goods like coal, iron ore, seafood, and textiles. I think that there is another problem here that hasn't gotten enough attention, and it is the domestic problems inside North Korea that result from from import seizing. So I picked up this. There was a very interesting story that Radio Free Asia carried a few days ago on tire shortages in North Korea. And I found that I find it to be very illustrative of what's going on, because what we have is North Korea is unable to import this seemingly very sort of not super essential good necessarily, but tires in this case. But what ends up happening when North Korea can't import items like this is that it creates these massive bottlenecks in very important parts of the economy. And that is really something that I don't think we paid enough attention to throughout when we look at the economic situation in North Korea under COVID. What actually happens with industries when the country cannot import what it needs to. So I'm gonna show a couple of graphs that I think illustrate the situation quite well. So when it comes to economic information on North Korea, we have very few sources. We have few credible sources, first and foremost, but we do have reports of market prices coming from sources inside North Korea through media outlets like the Daily NK and Asia Press. And this graph shows rice prices in North Korea from the beginning of COVID until the present. And it might look strange at first glance because we're not really seeing signs of immediate crisis when we look at the market prices for rice. But I don't think that means that we can assume that the economic situation of the country is stable or that the food situation is stable. I'm gonna explain why in just a second. But I think that when it comes to rice prices, what we're seeing is more of a fall on the demand side, that people don't have enough money to buy rice, which is the favorite staple good, compared with corn. And this is the graph that I think is perhaps a bit more alarming, because what we see from the beginning of from throughout 2020, we see prices of corn rising pretty steadily throughout the country. And what this tells me, and what this really says, is that people are switching over from consumption of rice to buying more corn, to having corn be a bigger part of their diet. Corn is a less preferred good on North Korean markets. It's basically, putting it in simple terms, it's what people buy when they can't afford to buy rice. So the fact that we see corn prices rising so much does indicate that food is indeed quite scarce in North Korea. We don't know exactly how scarce it is, but corn prices don't tend to rise in this way in the country. And another interesting thing I want to bring your attention to is this gray line here. You can see that for much of the graph, it's slightly higher than the other ones. This is also, it's not entirely unusual in the North Korean economy, but it's still quite interesting. This graph represents market prices in Hesan, in northeastern North Korea. And the fact that it is these price levels are so different from what we see in Pyongyang, the capital city, and Siniju in the northwest. It indicates that moving goods within North Korea has become very difficult, and that it's become more difficult throughout the past couple of years. And this seems to me to be quite indicative of the regime inhibiting movement through the country to a greater extent than it usually does. And this is quite problematic for the food supply and for the markets. So that's really all I wanted to share. I look forward to discussing this topic with all of you today, and thank you for giving me the floor.
So I just had a quick question on those three different lines on your graph for the three different cities. Could you just explain a little bit about why those three cities are so important? What's different about them?
So basically, it's the cities that we have data from, and the data that I use for the most part comes from Daily NK, which is an outlet that some of you might be familiar with. But it's basically where they have sources. That's one explanation. The reason that these cities are important is that they're in very different parts of the country. I mean, Pyongyang is sort of the capital city. In a way, it's an economy of its own because people there have access to goods that are much harder to find in other parts of the country. Siniju, the other city that prices come from, that's the border. It's the main hub for trade with China, and it's also very well connected to Pyongyang and other parts of North Korea through roads, which Heisen is much harder to get to, but Siniju is sort of a more well-connected city. So so they sort of tell us slightly different things about different parts of the country, and we also shouldn't exaggerate the how much we can really tell from this data either, because as we all know, it's very difficult to get information from North Korea. For most other countries on Earth, basic data is quite easy to access, but this is sort of the best we've got. But there are a lot of methodological issues with this kind of data, and I'm happy to talk more about that as well.
Sure.
But overall, I do want to emphasize that this is the data that we have, and it's very important to use it in the best possible way.
Sure. I think many of our audience are probably under the impression that prices in Korea are actually just set by the government. But
right.
So these prices here that you're giving, are they government set prices, or are they, subject to the market?
No, so these are market prices. I should probably have clarified that, but these are prices that are reported from marketplaces in North Korea, and these markets operate in sort of some of them operate in sort of a legal gray zone. But for the most part, ever since the early 2000s, the North Korean government has allowed for these markets to expand, and the government has in many ways been quite supportive of these marketplaces expanding, and they've instituted a permit regime, which is sort of like by North Korean law, there is no private property, but in practice, the government hands out permits to market traders in exchange for a fee. The government sets up, or at least condones, the building of market structures, like the physical buildings for these marketplaces. So it is the government has a very unclear role today in North Korea when it comes to food supply. It's definitely still has a role to play, but it's quite limited.
Yeah, and so the market in Sinju, that's the one that's close to the Chinese border, right? So is that likely to be have more access to trade with China even during this time? Are the prices there being influenced by that, do you think?
So it's very interesting. I think that if we're talking normal times before COVID, Sinju definitely had better access to sort of import to, it was sort of it is a hub for North Korean trade with China. But since the border has virtually been shut closed since the beginning of COVID, it's very it's very unclear what has actually been able to get through the border. And I mean, with Hesan in the Northeast, it's also a very important city for border trade, but much more so for not at the same scale, not in the same official way. There's a lot of smuggling across the border, and cities in the Northeast like Hesan that are sort of they've traditionally been more sort of, smuggling has been more prominent in those parts of the country than in other parts. But I mean, what we've seen since the beginning of COVID is really quite remarkable. With the North Korean government has clamped down in an extraordinary way on things like on illegal smuggling across the border, which usually the state would turn a blind eye to in exchange for bribes to the right people and things like that. But I mean, the North Korean government has even, and I believe they've even sort of dropped, they put up posters along the border telling people that basically if you cross the border, we will shoot on sight, which is not the standard practice. And even people on the Chinese side of the border have been warned that North Korean border guards will shoot them as well. So it is, they've really done everything they can to make sure that no one comes in or out. Right. And the sort of the force with which the state has imposed these measures is really quite remarkable, even for a government that uses a lot of force in normal times.
So this is really a reaction to COVID, right? They're trying to protect their country from COVID.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. That's sort of the main reason. But there is a quite plausible theory that I'm not 100% sure I buy it entirely, but many people speculate that COVID has been an excuse for more potentially conservative, whatever you want to call them, elements within the North Korean government that want to see less of market trade. They want to see a less free economy, and they want more of a return to North Korea's traditional social model of tight government control over the economy. And COVID has provided a very good opportunity in that sense, because in the name of national security and public health, you can take all these measures that maybe would not have been acceptable in normal times, that might not have found a lot of favor among decision makers, but now all of a sudden there's this opportunity to really roll things back in the governance of the economy, and it's very plausible. I'm not sure we have enough evidence to fully to really accept this as the truth, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, right. I was wondering if you have any speculations about what is on that freight train that just arrived. It really seems, unbelievable to me that after 2 years, no freight trains, nothing, no trade, and then suddenly a train comes in.
Yeah. So I should clarify that there has been some transportation via ships before, like even before this train crossed the border. So some things have been getting through, but just of such small quantities. So what's on that train it's anyone's guess. I hope we'll find out. I suspect we won't.
Yeah, I think one of our previous speakers talked about how reliant North Korea is on oil imports.
Yeah.
And that is actually crucial for their agricultural economy to be able to run their farm machinery and everything.
Absolutely. No, it's and that's sort of what I mean with the bottlenecks that I mentioned. That it's for the most part we look at the difficulty for the North Korean government in getting sort of export revenue. They're not able to export things and earn money. But just as important as these goods that create problems through through the entire economy when they're unable to be imported. And I'm not so oil is one of those things that it's most of North Korea's oil supply is not technically officially imported. It comes through a pipeline from China near Dandong and goes to a refinery near Siniju. That's sort of the main line that North Korea has for fuel. And so most of that data isn't actually officially recorded because it's not trade per se. China sort of, it's part of it is more of a sort of donation. Part of it is imported and is purchased by North Korea, but it's very hard to tell exactly what's what. But yes, absolutely, it's North Korea is absolutely completely reliant on oil imports.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have a question here that's kind of related from Liz Kim with Voice of America. She's asking, do you think the recent resumption of North Korea-China train operation is going to be something that's here to stay, or is it just a gift for the New Year celebration?
That's really the $1 million question. I actually wrote a little piece about this on North Korean Economy Watch, which is a website that I run. That's really the question that we should be focusing on, I think, because there's been a lot of rumors over the past couple of years of the border reopening any minute, and there's been like chatter among Chinese traders who work with North Korea that border trade is going to reopen, and we've seen several of these reports in quite credible media outlets with sources inside North Korea, and then we've still seen nothing has changed in the end. But so it really remains to be seen whether this is a permanent change, whether this is going to continue or not. So if I were a North Korean if I was a North Korean reliant on imports or exports from China, I would maybe not celebrate just yet. I would wait a few weeks at least to sort of see how regular this becomes. And also another question is, how are the quarantine routines going to work on the North Korean side? They've built up, we've seen through satellite imagery over the past year or so that the government has built all these quarantine facilities to inspect and disinfect goods that come into the country. We just don't know exactly how these work, how efficient they are, how long the processes are going to be. Because I mean, there's been there's been like goods piling up, waiting to be let into North Korea through various crossings, but it's sort of been held up because of these COVID-related routines. And so that's another question to be on the lookout to sort of keep an eye on, is what capacity, what type of routines is the North Korean government going to operate when it comes to quarantine and sort of and disinfection, and how long that's going to take is going to have pretty significant consequences for the overall flow of trade. So there are this is a very recent development, and there are a lot of things that sort of remain to be seen on this.
Yeah, it could take them many months or even years just to clear the backlog of stuff that is waiting to get into the country, right?
Maybe not years, but quite a while.
Yeah.
I'd imagine.
So I'm going to give you a break for a little while, Ben, and we're going to move on to Norman and hear from him and get some statements, and then we'll get you back on again at the end so that we can have some further discussion. So I'd just like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Norman A. Bailey. He grew up in Chicago and attended Oberlin College and Columbia University. He then joined the faculty of the City University of New York for a number of years, combining a teaching career there with an investment banking career. He also began to publish extensively, both in academic journals and journalistic articles, And his consulting activities involved all parts of the world: Latin America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, and of course, Asia. So in 1981, he joined the senior staff of the National Security Council at the White House. And then he joined the faculty of the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. In 2011, he moved with his wife to Israel, where he taught at the National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa, and has continued to publish many books and articles, with various honorary degrees from different institutions, including from Hanyang University in Korea. And it says here he has an Order of Knighthood. And I have to ask you, Norman, who has given you an Order of Knighthood? And should I be calling you Sir Norman Bailey?
No, American citizens are not permitted to use titles of nobility or knighthood. The doctor is a perfectly good title, which I'm happy to respond to.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you very much for this introduction. And as I heard Henry Kissinger say once after an laudatory introduction, thank you very much for that introduction. My father would have been proud and my mother would have believed it. Anyway, I've entitled my short comments this afternoon, The Koreas in 2022. And we'll start with the situation in and with North Korea since the inauguration of the Biden administration almost exactly 1 year ago. As Roger mentioned at the very beginning, there has been a remarkable amount of discussion in the government circles in North Korea on the economic situation in the country, much more so than usual. And that has been both in the party Congress, as he mentioned, and also by Kim Jong-un himself in various speeches and appearances. These comments, particularly the ones made directly by Kim, are signaling reform without spelling out what's meant by that. And as far as we can see from the West, without any actual visible action to create a situation of reform. If there is going to be economic reform in North Korea, my guess is that it will take the form that it has taken in Cuba for the last 5 or 6 years, and that is permitting private enterprise in certain areas of the economy, particularly in services such as seamstresses, shoe repair, restaurants, and things of that kind. And perhaps the setting up of some kind of similar situation in the countryside. However, set off against that, very recently, within the last month or so, there's been all of a sudden a lot of saber rattling coming out of North Korea. And most recently with the display of what was said to be a hypersonic missile. A hypersonic missile, as opposed to a regular missile, is almost impossible to detect and therefore to defend against. And if it is true that North Korea now has and can manufacture hypersonic missiles, this is a potential game changer, not only in the Far East, but even possibly in the Middle East. If North Korea supplies, for example, Iran with either the missiles themselves or the technology in order to produce such missiles, this would make a very big difference in the relationship between Iran on the one hand and Israel and the Arab Gulf states on the other hand. As far as relations between the Biden administration and the regime in North Korea, there's really not much has happened. And apparently, North Korea is not high on the Biden agenda. Moving now to South Korea, because after all, with the exception of China, South Korea is the country by far the most important in the world, the most important to North Korea. South Korea, during the past year, has been seen as a success story on confronting COVID, added to its reputation as one of the most successful countries in the world. Various organizations provide lists of successful countries versus unsuccessful countries and so on and so forth, ranging from Switzerland at one end to, let's say, Venezuela at the other end. South Korea has always been very high on any such list, adding to its for its reputation as coming up from the ruins of the post-Korean War period, and within a few decades rebuilding, developing a highly successful and competitive economy, and a successful and peaceful transition from military dictatorship to democracy. South Korea now needs to tackle its major social and economic problem, in my opinion, and that is financial inequality. The South Koreans could apply various techniques of expanded capital ownership, such as cooperatives, employee stock ownership plans, and community investment trusts. There are examples of such programs from the United States and elsewhere in the world, and it would be relatively easy for a country the size of South Korea to apply such techniques. Or, and in my opinion, even better, they could adopt an overall capital expansion program using central bank credit to the commercial banking system when those credits are used by the commercial banking system for capital expansion with a citizen ownership provision for the entire population of the country. Why do I say that this would be extremely important with reference to our topic today? Because with the modern technologies, it is impossible to keep developments of this significance and size from the population in North Korea. And pressures on the regime to liberalize and adopt similar policies would become, in my opinion, so powerful that they would create the conditions for what everyone, I'm sure, at least in this audience, would find highly desirable, and that is peaceful regime change in North Korea to a democratic political system and a market economy. And that, I think I'll close with that, Roger, at this point.
Thank you very much for the opening remarks there. We did have a couple of questions that came in, and I don't know if you have the answers, but let me try anyway. Do you know if there are labor institutions in North Korea? Do they have the equivalent of, a trade union or a labor union,
Yes,
even if they're controlled by the government?
Yes, they have labor unions, which are entirely instruments of the government.
So they don't function in any independent sense. They are pretty much following the party line all the time, right?
Absolutely. No, not pretty much, completely.
Completely. Another question going back, do you know anything about Korea's electricity generation capability? Do they have enough to cover their own needs, or are they importing electricity?
No, the North Korea has no need to import electricity. They have large coal production, and they use coal generation plants to provide electricity.
Great, thank you. So we're going to open it up. If people have additional questions that you would like to ask, please put them into the chat and we'll try and get to them as we go through this. But we wanted to open it up to just a general discussion. So let's bring Ben back onto the screen here. And so one of the questions I wanted to put to both of you here was, if there was to be some kind of reform that was to happen within the North Korean economy, is that something that can happen spontaneously from within, or do you think that it's going to require official government approval or sanction to do that? Yes, Ben, you go ahead first.
So I just want to clarify that there has, for the past couple of decades, there have been enormous changes in the North Korean economy. While private enterprise was virtually completely illegal before the 1990s or the early 2000s, the government has increasingly allowed for private businesses and private entrepreneurs to operate through very complicated frameworks. Like we're really talking about, in a lot of cases, corruption that ironically makes the economy run more efficiently. But it's definitely something that happens, especially within the small business sector and the service sector. But it's not a private, or it's not a sort of liberal or market in the sense that we would think of it, with sort of protections for private property, a transparent legal system or anything like that. So it's still nominally a communist economy, but in practice, it's much more complicated than that. So, and to answer your question, I mean, a lot of this development has been sort of bottom up in a lot of ways. Like what the marketplaces, for example, which are probably the most important ways for North Koreans to buy their food and sort of other necessities today, they began to grow increasingly large during during the famine, and then sort of too large for the government to actually to try to stamp them out, although there have been waves of stronger economic repression for sure than in other years. But in a lot of ways, I mean, I think that when we look at North Korea today, the government doesn't necessarily regard the market or private economic activity as a threat in its own right, because it's just become, private economic activity has just become so important for the North Korean economy as a whole, that it's really not something that the government can get rid of. What I do think that they are trying to do right now, and especially over the past couple of years, is to take back some of the overall control over the economy. That is, the government wants to be able to tax enterprises, like semi-private enterprises. They want to be able to sort of guide the overall direction of the economy. But I don't think that they're heading back towards this sort of Stalinist central planning or anything like that. So yes, I believe that the government sort of in the sort of long run does see market mechanisms as indispensable for the economy, and they're sort of trying to find their way to a model in which they can both enforce as much control over the economy as they need to, but at the same time let market mechanisms operate to the extent that they don't threaten state power.
So if they don't have taxes, right? They don't have income taxes in North Korea, right? They don't have real estate taxes. How does the government actually raise money?
So they technically don't have taxes, but there are all kinds of fees on. I mean, when it comes to the real estate sector is sort of a chapter of its own, but I think the actual marketplaces, like if you look at the way they're run, traders have to pay a fee to the states, and And I believe that there are also arrangements for the government to sort of get a certain percentage of surplus income and things like that. So for all intents and purposes, they do have a tax system. It's just not called that. And it's also, I mean, it's a very unclear regime when it comes to governing the economy. Like there isn't sort of, you can't, in North Korea, you can't, there isn't a one rule book for how the economy operates. It
Right.
depends a lot on the local apparatchiks of wherever you might be. And I think that this is something the government wants to change. They want to operate a more sort of the word I'm looking for is not transparent necessarily, but sort of a unified system in a sense, a one set of one rule book for the entire economy. And I think that that's really going to be one of the main struggles of for some time to come.
Got it. Well, it looks like we lost. Sorry. It looks like Norman got his internet interrupted. He told us beforehand that they had some storms in Israel recently, and his internet has been very bad since then. So I hope he can get back on. But in the meantime, Ben, you and I are going to have to hold it together here.
All right.
So we do have a couple of other questions and comments. So, but let me just go back here and find this. So yes. So China started allowing, this privatization to take place back in the 1970s, right? 78, 80, that kind of period. Why do you think it's taken so long for North Korea to do this? Is it just because of the ideological differences, or is there more to it?
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, I don't think that there's necessarily a natural trajectory that North Korea and sort of all countries move towards liberalization and a market economy. I don't think that that's a given necessarily. So I'm not sure that we should look at we should expect North Korea to move in one certain direction. But I mean, if the question is why did North Korea not reform at the same time as many other socialist countries did? I mean, one very important factor is the existence of South Korea. Even though South Korea is obviously much, incomparably wealthier than North Korea, inter-Korean competition is still something that, it's still very much a factor. So I think that there's been a sense within the regime that, they saw what happened with, I mean, for North Korea, the fall of the Soviet Union and the political changes in the former Soviet bloc serve as an example of what not to do, because they see it as, what some might see as political pluralism and democratization. From the North Korean government point of view, very much looks like a threat, not only to the regime's power, but sort of to the entire character of the state, in a sense. So to my mind, that's the most important explanation, that there's been, I mean, obviously, the government wants the economy to function better, but I think that they've simply been too weary of the potential negative consequences of sort of social unrest and socioeconomic pressure for socioeconomic change following economic change. I think that it's still something that they're not entirely prepared to cope with.
Yeah, I think I've heard stories that even North Korean defectors who go to South Korea really have a hard time in South Korea because of the incredible pressure of competing in that economy. And actually recently I heard there was a defector who redefected back to North Korea because we don't know why, can't read his mind, but perhaps he just couldn't cope with the pressure in South Korea. But moving on, I was wondering too, how do capital markets actually how would they work in a North Korean economy as it starts to reform? I mean, the way that, if I wanted to start a small business here, I could borrow some money from friends and family to get started. And then once I'd kind of got a proof of concept going, I could go to the local bank and say, here, would you support me? But how would that work in a North Korean situation?
I think it depends on what stage of, in this hypothetical transformation, what stage of it we're talking about. I mean, one very basic thing that would mean a lot is if, for example, if farmers were able to have some sort of ownership claim of the land that they're farming and to use that as collateral. That would be a very, very important change. I still think it's quite far away, but so in terms of exactly how it would work practically, I'm not sure, but it is one of the keys for some sort of long-term economic development. Really is to get capital markets functioning in some way. But it's important, but there are a lot of things that would really need to happen at the same time or even before. I mean, in order to have a functioning financial system of some sort, you need to have a judiciary that functions reasonably well. North Korea doesn't have that. It's not an institution that works in the way that we traditionally tend to think of it. So we're really talking about a scenario where so much changes in North Korea that I think that when we're trying to envision this, it's important to start with the really basic things.
And maybe we tend to think of the capitalist system, the U.S. system or the European system as the model that should be implemented, but perhaps there is a middle ground also.
So I certainly personally think that it would be good for North Korea in many ways if they adopted a more sort of a market economic system. I think that when we look at what's been happening, especially under Kim Jong-un, it's more likely that North Korea is going towards sort of a system of market Leninism with some room for private actors to operate within the economy, but still airtight political control. And I think that when we talk about reform and change and things like that, it's important to remember that from a North Korean perspective, the things that Trump said to Kim Jong-un during the summit of sort of look at this bright future you could have with a fully capitalist system. And I don't know, he had this video that he showed to Kim Jong-un of his vision of what North Korea could be, sort of interconnected with the rest of the world and part of global trading networks and things like that. I think that it can also be potentially a deterrent from the perspective of the North Korean regime to sort of this vision in which the state has a very different role from the role it has today probably appears very threatening to many people within the North Korean regime. And I think that they have their eyes set on something very different.
Threatening in the sense that if people were to gain their own independent, capital or finances, they would be less dependent on the state, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely one thing. But I think in the shorter term, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Chang Song-taek, the Kim Jong-un's uncle that he had executed in late 2013.
Oh yes.
And it seemed like this completely bizarre event, but when you look more closely at what had actually been happening in the lead up, like Chang Song-taek was a person who had benefited immensely from his trading contracts with Chinese firms, and the thing that really one of the things that really stuck out in all the in sort of how North Korean state propaganda talked about him was that he had amassed a sort of personal power around him partially through his economic dealings. And in North Korea, there can only be one center of power. It's a core tenet of the system that there can be only essentially one person in power. And that is one of the threats that I think is sort of the strongest on the radar is what will happen if people throughout society are able to build up their own fortunes and sort of gain power in society by means of economic activity. I think that's one of the main threats that they see.
Sure. I have some questions here around land ownership.
I think Norm came back, actually. I saw Norman. I think
Norm?
I saw him reappear. Yeah. For 1 second, I saw a little. Yeah.
No, there's a Norman Cohen. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
He might have popped in and then popped out again, but
yeah,
we'll wait and see. But anyway, you're doing a great job, Ben. So thank you.
Thank you.
I had some questions here come in about basic private ownership of property. Like, has any attempt been made to introduce worker ownership in, I think this means North Korea, not South Korea. So like cooperatives, profit sharing, those kind of things at all. And how does land ownership actually work? Does anybody own their own land in North Korea, or is it totally government owned?
It's totally government owned. There are various ways, like there are things like, so the housing market is actually a very interesting phenomenon in North Korea, where technically there is no private ownership of housing, but in practice you can get a sort of title to your house, so some sort of proof of not ownership in sort of the traditional sense, but still something. But it's and when it comes to was it collectives that you mentioned, like yeah, so it's on the local level with so I should just preface this by saying that my research for my doctoral dissertation was mostly with it focused on a big part of it focused on an institution known as the Inminban, and I see here in the audience there's a person, Alexander Zhepin, who has written a thesis on the Inminban that I've been trying to get a hold of for a long time. But anyway, there are definitely examples of group organization among civilian North Koreans for collaborating on filling government quotas or farming, and especially in market trade, where you have networks of people that collaborate with each other across the country. But that's sort of, to my knowledge, the extent of it. There isn't there's fairly little independence of villages and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah. So as an individual person, you wouldn't have any collateral that you could actually offer for a return,
really.
For a loan or anything like that.
Yeah. So, and that's really one of the big problems that that people, even people entrepreneurs who are able to earn substantial amounts of money, they really have nowhere to invest them. That's partially why the housing market, or the unofficial housing market in North Korea, has become quite hot over the past few years. It's one of the few avenues that people have to put their money into something that will make it grow. But that's another reason why we've seen Kim Jong-un, or the government under Kim Jong-un over the past few years, really trying to drive more of the cash that people have into sort of more productive uses, or from the government's point of view, productive uses. So there's been attempts to, last year there were reports that the government had opened a public bonds program where they would get people to buy bonds and sort of invest their money. But nothing really came of it. it seems like there was a lot of backlash against it, and there's been several attempts like that because people just don't trust the government to take care of their money in a way that's best that benefits them.
It's interesting what you're saying about the housing market. I hadn't heard about that. You're saying that there's like an underground or a black market for housing?
It's not necessarily a black market. So this is not my main area of research. But if you some people in the audience might have been following what's been happening in the capital city, Pyongyang, over the past, especially under Kim Jong-un, where you've had all these massive refurbishings of neighborhoods and entire parts of the city. And there's been a lot of construction of residential housing. And I mean, not just in Pyongyang for that matter. It's in Siniju near the Chinese border. It's you can see from the skyline changing that that new buildings are going up. And again, it's if you are a North Korean with a substantial amount of cash, which more and more people actually have, or before COVID, but if you're a North Korean that with a lot of cash that you've earned through private enterprise, again, housing is really one of the few things that you can do within the system, that you can invest in putting up in contributing to the construction of an apartment building, and then make a profit when you sell the apartment that you invested in. But again, all these, when we talk about these kinds of things in like private economic activity of this sort in North Korea, it's important to remember that when the government changes its mind, which does seem to have happened over the past couple of years, if it wants to take things in a different direction of towards more state control, there is nothing to prevent it from doing so. So you're really at the sort of these things only work to the extent that you're at the whims of whoever on in the sort of either on the local level or the central level of on what they decide is still what's going to happen. So that's why I think it's important to be to not exaggerate the extent of changes in the North Korean economy, because they are maybe not entirely possible to roll back, but still the government still very much has the last word.
Thank you. It's interesting about the housing because, with the Evergrande situation in China and the housing bubble that has come out there, it's a very similar kind of thing where people have been putting their life savings into housing, and it has, created this huge growth in development, but now they have too many homes because people have put all their money into it, right? So anyway, I wanted you to just give you a couple of minutes if you wanted to make a closing statement, and then we'll bring Dr. Jenkins on to kind of wrap up and tell us what's happening next. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor, and especially for giving me all this time to talk with half of our panel having been disconnected. I'm actually not entirely sure what to say for a closing statement. I mean, I think that when we talk about sort of opportunity and change and things like that in the North Korean economy, it's very important to remember that we're coming from a very low level to these things. North Korea is a very poor country, with a lot of impoverished people in it, and there are very basic things like infrastructure, railroads and roads, and just like very basic things like that that are very much lacking in North Korea, or they're not in a good enough condition to be to function the way they're intended to. So I think that it's important to like in a lot of these contexts when people discuss the opportunities for change in the North Korean economy and sort of doing things like encouraging special economic zones in North Korea and stuff like that. I mean, all these things are very important, but there are very basic things that really need to happen that should be that should be on the sort of the top of the list of priorities. And I'm not sure that the actors involved are always conscious of that. I hope it's not too pessimistic of a closing statement, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd just like to invite Dr. Michael Jenkins now to join us on the screen, to say a few closing remarks. Dr. Jenkins is the president of the Universal Peace Federation International and the president of the Washington Times Foundation. Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Roger. This was just an excellent program. Thank you, Dr. Silberstein. Your insights and your knowledge really opens our minds to different perspectives on North Korea. And I think Professor Bailey also, every Tuesday we're here with a different program looking from different angles, sometimes from the diplomatic side or the economic side. Next week, we'll be dealing with the media. We have Guy Taylor from the Washington Times and several other media experts that are going to look at their knowledge of what happened just a couple days ago with the firing off of 2 more missiles, actually yesterday, and also in the month of January, 2 other missiles. And that also generates another level of discussion. We really are also working very diligently on the peaceful reunification of Korea long term. And that visionary thinking is coming from the Universal Peace Federation together with 38 North and many others. We're very, very honored to be part of this. Our sister organization, the Washington Times Foundation, also hosts the Washington Brief every first Tuesday of the month. And if you want to go see those programs, are stored on the washingtonbrief.org. We're happy for you to look at that. We hope to see you next Tuesday for our media discussion. Dr. Silberstein, once again, excellent program. The moderation by Roger was the best. And thank you, Professor Bailey. And thank you to all our viewers. This time I see we have quite a contingent from all over the world. So I think we hit a very important topic. And we're constantly bringing our experts together from these different fields. And we do think change is happening. However, we also have to realize that there must be engagement. There must be development and engagement. Right now, there's not enough engagement from the West with North Korea in terms of dialogue and understanding and moving forward. The sanctions are very punitive, and there's questions now whether they're really helping us get further down the road to denuclearize and open up a possibility of a transition to a free society that would have economic development. But we're going to work on that together. We thank you. We're also affiliated with the Washington Times, the daily newspaper in Washington, and we thank you all for this wonderful program. Roger, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Dr. Silberstein, for your contribution, and
thank you for
Dr. Jenkins for your wrapping up. And we hope to have you on again before too long. Right.
All right. Looking forward to
Bye,
it.
everyone.
Bye.
God bless all of you from Pakistan.
Thank you.
Yes, welcome, Brother Roger. God bless you, everyone. Have a blessed day.